Welcome to History San Diego. I'm George Farrar. As we do from time to time here on the channel, I now take a look beyond San Diego at a decade in American history, 1860s America. At the dawn of the 1860s, America, the United States of America, had so much happening. A growing railroad network, commerce and trade, both nationally and internationally and regionally. People were increasingly reading about the lives of other Americans in the United States through media. In 1850, California had been added to the Union. Settlers were increasingly moving west. Immigrants were immigrating into these teeming, huge cities on the East Coast and also eventually then again on the West Coast. And also the Pony Express had briefly started to courier out west. But technology was already shoving it aside with the telegraph and the ability of the telegraph to go up quickly and for people to electronically communicate very quickly through Morse code. And so a telegraph line and lines would be extended across the West. And so the country, in a sense, became easier to traverse as the 1860s went on. But we must talk about slavery and we must talk about injustice because that was the hot topic in the late 1850s going into 1860. A brutal exploitation of men, women, and children of African American descent in the South. And it reached the mass media, and it was inflamed in a lot of ways through newspapers and placards and meetings, communications amongst people. And there were fights, even one on the floor of the United States Senate. In 1857, James Buchanan, arguably one of our worst presidents, took office as President of the United States. Roger Taney, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, put down the decision, one of the worst it was considered, the Dred Scott decision. Along comes Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. He was a former congressman who had been opposed to the Mexican-American War. He was a former state legislator. He was a lawyer. And in 1858, he got the nomination of the Republican Party to be their nominee for an election for a United States Senate seat from Illinois. And in this speech that he gives after he is nominated, he says the following: "We're now far into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I don't expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." Ultimately, Abraham Lincoln did not win the election to be a United States Senator from Illinois, but his message was received loud and clear, and it reached a national platform. His speech was read in New York, in the New York Daily Tribune in 1858. So even though he wouldn't win this election, he was positioned really well by understanding the narrative and the timing and the things that were at stake and the issues that were at hand. He was well positioned to be nominated by the Republican Party in 1860 to be their candidate for President of the United States. But before we get to 1860, we get to 1859 and the Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Wild-eyed abolitionist John Brown led a group of attackers to raid the federal arsenal, the armory, at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Colonel Robert E. Lee was called upon from the U.S. forces to help put down this standoff. So he helped put down the standoff, and there were people that died, there were people that were executed, there were people that fled. But what this incident, which was communicated very quickly over the telegraph wires to essentially was becoming more of a national audience day by day, was that there was some violence happening about slavery, and this was an attempt at a revolt. And along comes Abraham Lincoln, Republican candidate for President of the United States, running with Hannibal Hamlin as his vice presidential candidate. And he was running against Stephen Douglas, a Northern Democrat. He had lost to Douglas in that U.S. Senate race I was telling you about. And he also ran against Vice President John Breckinridge, a Southern Democrat, a big favorite of the South. And so there was this big election, a presidential election of 1860. And everything seemed to break down very regionally. Lincoln carried the Northeast. He carried the northern area of the established country. He carried California and Oregon. Breckinridge carried a lot of the South. And a man named Bell won some states. So this was a very split vote, but ultimately Lincoln won in the electoral vote and carried 40% of the popular vote. And so you have this big election. The election results themselves lay bare the differences between the regions of this nation. And so you do have to wonder if the Democrats had not split between a northern and southern faction, whether the results would have been different. But the results were what they were, and ultimately Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th president of the United States. Now, there's a problem. There was so much time between the election and the swearing in of the new president. So there was a lame duck period that extended from November and December into March. The president back then was not sworn in until March of the following year. So this gave plenty of time for Southerners. Some Southerners were characterized as fire eaters for their efforts, their successful efforts, to get each of the states within the South to organize at the state level to break away from the United States of America. And so in the winter, towards the end of 1860, going into 1861, the unthinkable happened. Southern states seceded from the United States of America, and there was nothing really that was done about it. The person we'd characterize as one of our worst presidents, James Buchanan, was not able to accomplish anything. There was no leadership. There was a leadership in waiting. So really at the time, the only time there was any leadership in February of 1861 was in Montgomery, Alabama, when the Confederate States of America formed up, and they swore in their president, their man to be president of their new nation, Jefferson Davis. So that region themselves decided they were going to split off, and they basically successfully, administratively did it in the early months of 1861. So there's a lot for incoming President Abraham Lincoln to face, to deal with. And the national priorities are going to be interesting because, as you can see here, the dome of the United States Capitol building, the new dome of the United States Capitol building, was under construction. And so amidst all of this construction, there was an inauguration. And President Lincoln delivered his inaugural speech, his first inaugural speech. And so the country had to get to work awfully quickly. What we would call the Union, being the states that did not secede from the United States, that remained and acted as a entire nation throughout, they had to get volunteers for a war, ultimately draft people for the war, to fight the South. And so all of this happening in March and April of 1861. In April of 1861, The Confederates fire on Fort Sumter, in Charleston Harbor, in South Carolina, and the war begins in earnest. Now, here's where we reach the part of the show where I explain to you that our emphasis is going to be on a lot of developments and things that happened in the 1860s, but will not be a telling of the military developments of the war. As part of this show, I'll be presenting to you various things that have gone on in the 1860s. And the Civil War was a massive, horrible thing, a monster it was, because somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000, possibly estimated to be more, people died during the United States Civil War. And it was a bloody, nasty business, what with cannons and cannonballs flying through the air, people being gunned down or their limbs blown apart. So it was an ugly business that was, of course, in itself, as we saw with the election results, quite a regional affair. A lot of the battles and the dying were confined really to the southern states. When you look broadly at the development of the United States, you look at the battlefields, you look where the battles were, and you look at what ultimately resulted. When you think of Sherman's March to the Sea, when you think of the burning of Atlanta, the fall of Richmond, the deprivation of Vicksburg, Mississippi, the bloodiness of Gettysburg, there was a lot of dying that went on, and there was levels of, for those people who will be invited to read the military history, sure saw levels of incompetence and corruption and questions of what might have been. Now, Lincoln wasted no time, though, to go ahead and move forward with the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. And so that was something I think that we would look at and say that was one of his greatest accomplishments, if not the greatest accomplishment, to free the slaves in the places where he could free them and set that as the tone going forward as the war would eventually move towards resolution. While we often hear about President Lincoln's great oratory, for example, the Gettysburg Address, and we hear about his leadership and working with the different generals to get victory accomplished in the Civil War, we don't often hear about the great policy decisions that were made that came out of the White House and Congress. For example, the Homestead Act of 1862, which would have a dramatic impact on the very landscape of the nation in the future, directly impacting and helping out California and other western states. It was decided that people would be encouraged to populate on surveyed public land. All they would have to do for 160 acres would be to pay a filing fee, live continuously for 5 years on the land, do improvements on the land, and farm. And in 5 years, they would get title. Now, there were certain things that went on. People would stake their claim. Eventually, they would get title and sell the land to a company or things like that. There were a lot of different things that happened. But this encouraged settlement to continue and to move further out west and gave an incentive guaranteed by the United States government to people to go live. It was incredible. And then they had the land grant colleges that they did. So where they would fund the purchase of land for agricultural colleges around the country. The United States Congress and the President decided to invest in these things. And then along with all of this, there's the railroad. And so let me just read to you now President Lincoln's view of where things stood in his 1863 Thanksgiving Proclamation. In the midst of a civil war of unequaled magnitude and severity, which has sometimes seemed to invite and provoke the aggressions of foreign states, peace has been preserved with all nations, order has been maintained, the laws have been respected and obeyed, and harmony has prevailed everywhere, except in the theater of military conflict, while that theater has been greatly contracted by the advancing armies and navies of the Union. The needful diversions of wealth and strength from the fields of peaceful industry to the national defense have not arrested the plow, the shuttle, or the ship. The axe has enlarged the borders of our settlements, and the mines as well of iron and coal as of the precious metals have yielded even more abundantly than heretofore. Population has steadily increased, notwithstanding the waste that has been made in the camp, the siege, and the battlefield, and the country, rejoicing in the consciousness of augmented strength and vigor, is permitted to expect continuance of years with large increase of freedom. We can see this continuation of the national work with the topping of the dome of the United States Capitol building from this photograph from December 1863, and there is a starting of work to get started a transcontinental railroad system. And Ulysses Grant rises through the ranks of the Union Army and delivers victory, which will ultimately start towards delivering peace. But in 1864, it's incredibly bloody. The battlefields churn on and on and on. And President Lincoln runs for re-election against General George McClellan. This time, Lincoln has as his vice presidential candidate a man from Tennessee named Andrew Johnson. He was a senator, a governor, and became vice president when President Lincoln was reelected, and they are sworn in March of 1865. And here's where things start to happen very quickly. Richmond falls, and so in April 1865, President Lincoln visits Richmond. And of all the times I would have liked to have seen President Lincoln, it would have been Abraham Lincoln entering Richmond, Virginia on April the 4th, 1865. And so in April 1865, General Grant meets General Robert E. Lee of the Confederate States of America Army at McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, and accepts the surrender. And then President Lincoln and his wife go to a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. for a night of levity, and he is assassinated, the first president of the United States of America to be assassinated. And there was conspiracy. If a man named George Azarat had not gotten drunk, he would have killed the next in line for succession, Vice President Andrew Johnson. And the Secretary of State, William Seward, had been stabbed that night as well. So ultimately, Andrew Johnson, the Vice President, becomes President of the United States. He was a military governor in Tennessee. He was a governor in Tennessee. He was a senator from Tennessee. And he was very briefly Vice President of the United States. Andrew Johnson took power as President of the United States of America at one of the most dangerous, critical times. As a war was ending, his predecessor had been shot brutally, killed publicly in a Washington, D.C. theater. The assassin had been assassinated. The Secretary of State had been stabbed but would survive his wounds. It was pandemonium. And it was political pandemonium, and he had to rise to the occasion. He came from humble beginnings. He was a tailor of clothing. I visited his home in Tennessee and the place where he would do his tailoring. He was a man of grievance. He saw an aristocracy in the South and a way things were done, and he didn't like it. And he rubbed people the wrong way, and he went on a goodwill tour of the country in the 1860s, 1866. And it did not go well. President Johnson's term of office was characterized by a lot of presidential vetoes, which would be overridden by Congress. It was characterized by acrimony, the inability to work with the moderates and the radical Republicans to craft a really good, coherent Reconstruction policy. He had one, but ultimately it was rejected by Congress. We got 3 amendments to the United States Constitution. We got the abolition of slavery that abolished slavery, which certainly helped to start to heal the wounds after the Civil War. And also then the 14th Amendment. This granted citizenship rights, including birthright citizenship, a critically important amendment for civil rights. And another amendment, the 15th Amendment, men would get the right to vote that wouldn't be denied by race, color, or previous condition of servitude. While voting rights and citizenship rights were given quite freely in writing, the securing of those rights would go on for many, many, many years as African Americans faced violence, injustice, repression, discrimination. And while initially African Americans would have opportunities to vote, participate, and in some cases actually hold office at the state and federal level, year after year, those opportunities diminished. And by the 1870s, what's called the Bourbon Restoration occurred that restored the dominance of the white power structure in the South. And they held it, and some would say maybe still brutally hold it to this day, various federal laws and challenges withstanding. So there were the carpetbaggers and the scalawags. And the carpetbaggers were people that came down to the South, went down to the South in the 1860s and the 1870s, and they would make fortunes for themselves, sometimes economically or politically. And the scalawags were the people that in the South that supported it. And then the Reconstruction effort, there was a lot of confusion. And so there was a brief period of time in the late 1860s, early 1870s, where African Americans were going to have a part in governance, but that would be swept away. African Americans lost political power in the South, and they wouldn't regain it for over another 100 years. In 1867, the United States bought from Russia what we know of today as the state of Alaska for $7.2 million. At the time, it was called Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox because so much was paid for such a remote piece of land. But ultimately, when we look back, we see how much value Alaska had given the gold and oil that was there. So an amazing time, and in a sense really a new frontier for the United States of America to explore. And so we look at these times and we think about it and we go, wow, so much more to explore, so much more to do. And then Andrew Johnson was impeached, and he was acquitted in the Senate in his impeachment trial. He was the first president to be impeached, and he was not convicted in the Senate. He didn't run for re-election, and Ulysses Grant became president of the United States in 1869. We got a Transcontinental Railroad, and so a lot of effort was put in to build this railroad across the country. And yes, there was corruption and bribery that was discovered in the 1870s. But with all of this technology, the country moved forward. And in May of 1869, at a promontory in Utah, people came together to celebrate the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And folks, this photo here itself shows American accomplishment. Think about it this way. I began with a country on the verge of civil war, that went through a civil war, that went through social reforms, that went to tangibly provide a better future for Americans. And that's what we see in 1869. I'd like to thank you for watching History San Diego today. I enjoy bringing you these looks at American history decade by decade, as we also look at San Diego history decade by decade. Ahead, we're going to be taking a look at Alonzo Horton. We're going to begin our Great San Diegans series within the History San Diego series by taking a look at Alonzo Horton and looking at his life and looking at what he accomplished. And we're going to now go into a new time within the History San Diego series, and that is the beginnings, the development of what we will know eventually as modern San Diego. And so I'm really pleased to be able to bring this to you. If you haven't already done so, I want to encourage you to please subscribe to this channel and watch some of the shows in our past. We're in season 5. And also, if you want even more San Diego history, there's even more San Diego history for you to enjoy on Facebook groups at History San Diego. Thanks again for watching. Take it easy. See you later.